So you're back on the Arise Exchange. Global energy leaders are weighing the expected and the likely unexpected consequences of a wider Middle East war as the United States bombed selected Iranian nuclear facilities over the weekend. And of course, you saw the retaliation on the news just within a couple of hours ago. Earlier today, senior associate energy officials of the Center for Strategic and International Studies, or CSIS, held a forum to discuss the global energy security and the impact from the ongoing Israel-Iran war. Let's listen.
U.S. Central Command released footage on Saturday showing fighter jets taking off from an undisclosed location.
Well, one thing I can tell you, let's get that out of the way, Kay. The smart money is not short in this market for sure. But there are a number of reasons why the market is not going much higher. And, I'll come back to that in a brief second. Basically, what we've seen is roughly a $10 price increase since the beginning of the hostilities, which is not much for the old days. As we remember before, people were expecting, even Goldman Sachs still expect the market to go over $110 a barrel if we lose half of the oil coming out of the Strait of Hormuz. I think the biggest problem is, first of all, expectation of the market. And we can talk about it. Rad will step in, I'm sure, about possibility or feasibility of blocking the Strait of Hormuz. On its own, Iran exports up to 2 million barrels of crude and petroleum products, which is not a huge amount given that at the moment supply and demand situation is rather precarious for the producers. For example, OPEC Plus have at least 6.5 million barrels of spare capacity. China is not firing on all cylinders, and demand, if anything, seems to be peaking, at least for gasoline. We have a situation where, if I could draw a demand and supply curve, we are very much on the sort of elastic part of the supply curve. So any shift in demand really doesn't do much. Equally, any shift in supply doesn't have big impact on oil prices. So as things stand right now, it seems to me that the market is pricing in the fact that Iran is very unlikely to do anything about the Strait of Hormuz, which I think is the key in this whole story. And the reason is, number one, that Iran has never done that in the past. They might have tried in the 80s in the war with Iraq. And the second reason is that it would really, really hurt Iranian interests as well. Iran is desperate for that oil to be exported because they need hard currency. At the same time, all of their potential allies would be hurt. The biggest buyer of Iranian barrels by far is China. Okay, so and China very much has a lot of exposure to the shipping from the Strait of Hormuz. In terms of crude and products, some 5 million barrels a day. So the whole of Asia, India would be hurt a lot. So really, this whole crude oil story is very much biased. We are looking at it very much from the Western perspective, but it's really Asia that worries a lot about what's going on in the area. So I guess that will be the focus, Strait of Hormuz, and possibility of potentially blocking it. And sort of geopolitical situation, which I think is very, very important because we haven't heard very much from China at this stage.
I wonder, Rod, when we think about maybe kind of where this is going and in terms of the scope, Israel's stated war aims from the beginning were the nuclear threat, the missile threats, but may have also expanded. It's pretty thinly veiled at this point to include change to the regime in Tehran and maybe even toppling the government. I believe, if I'm not mistaken, that one of President Trump's posts yesterday even flirted with or insinuated something about regime change. So the question for you is, would an expansion of the military campaign to include changes to the Iranian government translate to greater risk for Gulf energy exports?
Yeah, I think it would. I mean, the market seemed to be in a position to sort of paraphrase the great movie Jerry Maguire, show me the interruption. And so it wants to see, I think, very clear evidence of Iran taking steps. So yesterday's statement by the Iranian parliament, advocating for the closure of the Straits of Hormuz, worried the market, but still leaves wiggle room. It does go back to that political question. What is the end game? What is the end game for Israel? What is the end game for the United States? And critically, what does Iran perceive the end game of those two to be? I mean, we talk about Iran in terms of not wanting to take steps to hurt buyers in Asia. We talk about Iran not wanting to damage its relations with the Gulf states, the Arab Gulf states, that have, been largely, if rhetorically, but largely supportive of Iran in terms of this. Certainly have condemned the Israeli operation and, expressed a certain amount of concern about the U.S. operation over the weekend. But all of that presumes that Iran isn't fighting an existential battle or doesn't see itself as fighting an existential battle. If it does, then all bets will be off. The biggest priority will be protecting the regime and creating some form of deterrence and a sense of deterrence. And, oil is clearly something that the Iranian regime has been reluctant to interfere with thus far. The Straits of Hormuz hasn't really been interfered with to a great extent thus far. But if the Iranians perceive themselves to be in an existential battle, then we are back to something like the 1980s, where you had both Iraq and Iran targeting vessels, the missile wars, and a risk that you could see the Iranians certainly sort of mining parts of the Straits of Hormuz. But that is something for the future. It takes us back to what is the political end game here? And it's not clear. I mean, for the Trump administration thus far, the stated goal seems to be, the weekend was a one and done. And it was designed to send a message, and as long as Iran's response is contained, as long as Iran doesn't go after U.S. targets or something, it is something symbolic, then the Trump administration seemingly can live with it. You do have the wild card of the president himself, who on one day is tweeting about killing, the supreme leader of Iran, and on another day is talking about negotiations. If I was an Iranian leader right now, I'm not sure how much I would trust a word that comes out of President Trump's mouth. Certainly, it's a confusing set of signals. But I think the other issue is, what do the Israelis do next?
Well, let's talk a little bit more about the market reaction. And Adi, of course, this is your area of expertise. Many of our audience will know that in a way, there's actually two oil markets. There's the physical oil market where the wet stuff is traded. And then there's also the financial market with futures, options, other derivatives. So I'd like to hear your assessment of how both physical and financial traders are positioning for the possibility of escalation and maybe supply disruption. What are you seeing in some of the main metrics, market structure, maybe product differentials, arbitrage between geographical regions that give some sense of how the market is positioning for this?